The morning of November 18th, 1936, was cold in Harlem, with temperatures hovering around 38 degrees and overcast skies threatening rain. By 10 o'clock, Lenox Avenue was busy with Wednesday morning activity as shop owners opened their businesses, delivery trucks made their rounds, and residents conducted errands before the afternoon. The streets were crowded with people wearing heavy coats and hats against the November chill, their breath visible in the cold air as they moved between buildings. The offices of Consolidated Bookkeeping Services occupied the second floor of a three-story building on Lenox Avenue between 133rd and 134th Streets. The company was ostensibly a legitimate accounting firm serving Harlem businesses, but in reality it functioned as the administrative center for several numbers operations that had previously been controlled by Dutch Schultz before his assassination in October 1935. The office employed approximately 8 people who managed records, collected receipts from runners, calculated payouts, and maintained the financial infrastructure that supported the illegal lottery operations. Samuel Rothstein was 48 years old and had worked in Harlem's numbers racket for 23 years. Rothstein had started as a runner in 1913, collecting bets from customers and delivering them to central collection points. Rothstein had advanced through the organization over 2 decades, becoming a supervisor managing multiple runners, then an operations manager overseeing entire territories. By the early 1930s, Rothstein had become a senior lieutenant in Dutch Schultz's Harlem operations, responsible for managing the administrative systems that processed thousands of daily bets. After Schultz's death in October 1935, the transition of power in Harlem's underworld had created uncertainty about who would control the numbers operations Schultz had built. Bumpy Johnson had negotiated an arrangement with Lucky Luciano, where Harlem's black bookmakers would retain operational control in exchange for paying 15% of profits to the Italian Mafia. This arrangement applied primarily to black-controlled operations, but Schultz's organization had included Jewish managers like Rothstein, who occupied ambiguous positions in the new structure. Rothstein had continued managing the Consolidated Bookkeeping Services office through the transition, maintaining the administrative systems that processed bets and calculating payouts, as he had done under Schultz. Rothstein reported to Johnson regarding Harlem operations while also maintaining communication with representatives of Luciano's organization who monitored compliance with the profit-sharing arrangement. This dual reporting created tension, as Rothstein was simultaneously accountable to black and Italian authorities whose interests sometimes conflicted. On the morning of November 18th, Rothstein arrived at the Consolidated Bookkeeping Services office at his usual time of 9:30. Rothstein unlocked the office door and entered to find 2 men sitting in chairs near his desk. The men were Italian, both approximately 30 years old, wearing suits and overcoats. Rothstein did not recognize them and had not given them access to the office. One of the men, who introduced himself as Anthony Messina, stated that he and his associate Vincent Romano worked for certain people who had concerns about how profits from the Consolidated office were being calculated and distributed. Messina stated that their review of records suggested that the 15% being paid to Italian interests was being calculated on understated revenue figures, meaning the actual payments were less than the agreed percentage of true profits. Rothstein responded that all calculations were performed accurately, according to standard accounting procedures, and that he maintained detailed records documenting every transaction. Rothstein offered to show Messina the ledgers demonstrating how percentages were calculated. Messina declined to examine the records and instead stated that Rothstein would need to increase the payments to 25% to account for previous underpayments, effective immediately. Rothstein stated that he did not have authority to change the payment percentage, which had been negotiated between Johnson and Luciano. Rothstein explained that any changes to the arrangement would need to be discussed between the principals who had established it. Messina responded that Rothstein was being given an opportunity to resolve the matter quietly by agreeing to the increased payments. Messina stated that if Rothstein refused to cooperate, there would be consequences not just for Rothstein, but for his family. Messina then demonstrated knowledge of Rothstein's personal life that indicated surveillance had been conducted. Messina mentioned that Rothstein's wife, Rachel, took their daughter Rebecca to school each morning at 8:15, walking 6 blocks from their apartment to PS 89. Messina mentioned that Rothstein's son, David, worked as a clerk at a clothing store on 125th Street. Messina stated that cooperation would ensure Rothstein's family remained safe, while refusal would create risks that Rothstein should consider carefully. Rothstein felt his chest tighten as Messina spoke. The veiled threat against his wife and children was clear and terrifying. Rothstein had worked in criminal enterprises long enough to understand that such threats were not empty. Rothstein also recognized that acceding to Messina's demands would create different problems. Johnson would learn that the payment percentage had increased without authorization, would investigate why, and would discover that Rothstein had submitted to extortion without reporting it. Rothstein stated that he needed time to consider the situation and to review his options. Messina stated that Rothstein had until the end of the week to make a decision and that Messina would return on Friday morning to receive Rothstein's answer. Messina and Romano left the office without further conversation. After the two men departed, Rothstein sat at his desk, trying to control his shaking hands and racing heartbeat. Rothstein understood that he faced an impossible situation. If he agreed to Messina's demands and increased payments without authorization, Johnson would eventually discover the discrepancy and would conclude that Rothstein had been stealing. If Rothstein refused Messina's demands, his family would be in danger from men who had already demonstrated their willingness to surveil and threaten women and children. Rothstein considered contacting police, but recognized that law enforcement would be ineffective. The threats had been veiled rather than explicit, making prosecution difficult. Police in Harlem during 1936 were often corrupt and had relationships with organized crime figures, creating risks that reporting to police might simply alert more dangerous people to the situation. Rothstein understood that protection from organized crime threats required organized crime solutions rather than legal ones. Rothstein left the office at noon and walked to a small restaurant on 132nd Street, where he sometimes met with Johnson's associates. Rothstein asked the restaurant owner to send a message to Johnson, stating that Rothstein needed to speak with him urgently about a sensitive matter. The owner agreed to pass the message, and Rothstein returned to his office to wait. At approximately 4 p.m, Marcus Hendricks, one of Johnson's senior associates, arrived at the consolidated office. Hendricks was 45 years old, someone who had worked with Johnson for more than a decade and who handled various business matters requiring discretion and judgment. Rothstein explained what had happened that morning. 2 Italian men had entered his office, had accused him of underpaying the profit percentage, had demanded increased payments, and had threatened his family if he did not comply. Rothstein provided detailed descriptions of Messina and Romano, recounted the conversation as accurately as possible, and emphasized that the men had specific knowledge about his wife and children's daily routines, indicating surveillance. Rothstein stated that he did not know how to respond and sought guidance from Johnson regarding how to handle the situation. Hendricks listened carefully without interrupting. After Rothstein finished explaining, Hendricks asked several questions about when the men had arrived, how they had gained access to the locked office, whether they had touched anything that might have left fingerprints, and whether Rothstein had any prior contact with either man. Rothstein answered each question thoroughly. Hendricks stated that he would relay the situation to Johnson and that someone would contact Rothstein within 24 hours with instructions on how to proceed. Hendricks emphasized that Rothstein should not agree to Messina's demands and should not discuss the situation with anyone else. Hendricks also stated that Rothstein's family would be protected while Johnson determined how to address the threat. Hendricks left the office and went directly to Johnson's apartment on West 147th Street. Hendricks found Johnson reviewing financial records and explained the situation Rothstein had described. Hendricks provided all the details Rothstein had shared and emphasized that the threats against Rothstein's family created urgency, requiring immediate response. Johnson listened to Hendricks' account without visible reaction. After Hendricks finished, Johnson sat quietly for several minutes thinking through the implications of what had occurred. Johnson recognized that the situation involved multiple layers of problems requiring careful, strategic response. The immediate problem was that Messina and Romano had threatened Rothstein's family, creating danger that required protection. But the deeper problem was that their actions violated the arrangement Johnson had negotiated with Luciano. That arrangement had been based on clear understanding. Harlem operations would pay 15% to Italian interests, and in exchange, those operations would be left alone to function without interference. Messina and Romano's attempt to extort additional payments and their threats against Rothstein's family represented unauthorized actions that undermined the fundamental agreement. Johnson understood that his response to this situation would establish precedent affecting future interactions between his organization and Italian mob figures. If Johnson failed to protect Rothstein and allowed Messina to extort increased payments through threats, it would signal that the negotiated arrangement was not enforceable and that individual Italian enforcers could violate it without consequence. This would destabilize the entire structure Johnson had worked to establish and would invite further unauthorized actions. But Johnson also recognized that responding too aggressively could create different problems. If Johnson retaliated against Messina and Romano without first determining whether they were acting under orders from Luciano's organization or were freelancing, Johnson might inadvertently start a conflict with Luciano over a misunderstanding. The effective response required understanding who had authorized Messina's actions and addressing the problem through appropriate channels. Over the following hours, Johnson developed a comprehensive strategy to protect Rothstein's family while addressing the systemic threat that Messina's actions represented. The strategy had 4 integrated components: providing immediate protection for Rothstein's family, investigating whether Messina was acting under official authorization or independently, communicating with Luciano to clarify the situation, and demonstrating to Messina that threatening families under Johnson's protection carried severe consequences. The first component was immediate family protection. Johnson instructed Hendricks to assign 4 trusted associates to provide security for Rothstein's wife and children starting immediately. 2 would maintain watch over the Rothstein apartment at all hours. 2 would follow Rachel and Rebecca during their morning walk to school and would remain nearby throughout the day, ready to intervene if anyone approached them threateningly. Johnson also arranged for 2 additional associates to monitor David at his workplace. This protection would continue until the situation was resolved. The second component was investigation. Johnson needed to determine whether Messina and Romano were acting under orders from Luciano's organization or whether they were freelancing, attempting to extort money for themselves while falsely claiming to represent Italian mob interests. Johnson enlisted Thomas Chen, who maintained extensive contacts throughout New York's criminal networks, to gather information about Messina and Romano, including who they worked for, what operations they were involved in, and whether they had authorization to collect increased payments from Harlem operations. The third component was direct communication with Luciano's organization. Johnson could not allow the situation to escalate based on assumptions about whether Messina had official backing. Johnson needed to communicate directly with Luciano or with Luciano's senior representatives to clarify whether the increased payment demands represented official policy or unauthorized extortion. This communication needed to be handled delicately to avoid appearing to challenge Luciano while also making clear that Johnson expected the negotiated arrangement to be honored. The fourth component was demonstrating consequences. Regardless of whether Messina was acting under orders or freelancing, threatening families under Johnson's protection needed to result in severe costs that would deter future similar actions. Johnson needed to respond in ways that protected his reputation and authority while avoiding actions that would appear to challenge Luciano unnecessarily. Johnson implemented the first component immediately. By the evening of November 18th, 4 associates were positioned to protect the Rothstein family. 2 men stationed themselves in a car across from the Rothstein apartment building with clear views of the entrance. 2 others positioned themselves near PS 89 to observe the morning school walk. These security arrangements were invisible to the Rothstein family, but provided comprehensive coverage against any attempted attack. Chen began his investigation on November 19th, speaking with contacts in Italian mob circles to learn about Messina and Romano. Within 24 hours, Chen had gathered significant information. Messina and Romano were low-level enforcers who worked for a capo named Vincent Costanza, who controlled operations in parts of Brooklyn. Messina and Romano had no official authorization to collect payments from Harlem operations. They appeared to be freelancing, using their Italian mob connections to intimidate Rothstein into paying them directly. Chen's investigation also revealed that Costanza himself might not have ordered or known about Messina and Romano's actions. The 2 enforcers appeared to be acting independently, seeing an opportunity to extort money from Jewish operators who occupied uncertain positions in the new power structure following Schultz's death. Messina and Romano apparently calculated that Rothstein would be vulnerable because he was not clearly protected by either black or Italian authorities. This information transformed Johnson's understanding of the situation. Messina and Romano were not representatives of Luciano's organization attempting to renegotiate terms. They were low-level criminals exploiting confusion in the power transition to run an unauthorized extortion scheme. This meant Johnson could address the problem without creating conflict with Luciano, but it also meant Johnson needed to demonstrate that such unauthorized actions would not be tolerated. Johnson arranged a meeting with Frank Costello, who was one of Luciano's senior associates and who managed relationships with various criminal organizations in New York. The meeting occurred on November 21st at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Johnson explained the situation to Costello systematically. 2 men claiming to represent Italian interests had threatened a numbers operator in Harlem, had demanded increased payments beyond the negotiated percentage, and had threatened violence against the operator's family if he did not comply. Johnson emphasized that he was not accusing Luciano's organization of violating their arrangement, but rather was informing Costello that individuals were falsely claiming to represent Italian mob interests while conducting unauthorized extortion. Johnson stated that he wanted to clarify whether these individuals had official backing before taking action to protect the people under his authority. Costello understood immediately what Johnson was communicating. Costello stated that no one in Luciano's organization had authorized any changes to the payment percentages or any threats against operators in Harlem. Costello stated that if individuals were falsely claiming to represent Italian mob interests while conducting unauthorized extortion, that was a serious matter that Costello's organization would address. Costello asked for the names of the individuals involved. Johnson provided the names Anthony Messina and Vincent Romano and explained that they appeared to work for Vincent Costanza in Brooklyn. Costello stated he would investigate and would ensure that appropriate action was taken. Costello emphasized that the arrangement between Johnson and Luciano remained in effect and that unauthorized actions by low-level enforcers would not be permitted to undermine that arrangement. This meeting with Costello accomplished several strategic objectives. It clarified that Messina and Romano were not acting under official authorization. It established that Luciano's organization considered their actions problematic. It created alignment between Johnson and Costello regarding the need to address the situation, and it positioned Johnson to take protective action without appearing to challenge Italian mob authority. Johnson also needed to address Messina directly to demonstrate that threatening families under Johnson's protection carried immediate consequences. Johnson could not simply wait for Costello to investigate and discipline Messina through Italian mob channels, because doing so would create appearance that Johnson depended on Italian authorities to protect people in Harlem. Johnson needed to demonstrate his own capability to address threats while also coordinating with Costello to ensure his actions did not create unwanted conflict. Johnson arranged for Messina to be contacted on November 22nd and invited to a meeting at a location in Harlem to discuss the payment arrangements he had raised with Rothstein. The message was delivered through intermediaries in ways that suggested Johnson was willing to negotiate, encouraging Messina to attend the meeting, confident that his extortion attempt was succeeding. Messina arrived at the specified location, a warehouse on West 142nd Street, at the appointed time of 7 in the evening on November 22nd. When Messina entered the warehouse, he found Johnson seated at a table with 4 associates standing nearby. Johnson gestured for Messina to sit across from him. Johnson stated calmly that he understood Messina had visited Samuel Rothstein to discuss payment arrangements and had raised concerns about calculations. Johnson asked Messina to explain who had authorized him to renegotiate the payment percentages that had been agreed between Johnson and Luciano. Messina responded that he was representing certain interests that believed the current payments were insufficient, and Johnson asked Messina to identify specifically which interests he represented and who had given him authority to demand increased payments. Messina provided vague responses suggesting he was acting on behalf of Italian mob authorities without naming specific individuals. Johnson then stated that he had spoken with Frank Costello, who confirmed that no one in Luciano's organization had authorized any changes to payment percentages or any collection activities in Harlem beyond the established arrangement. Johnson stated that this meant Messina had been conducting unauthorized extortion while falsely claiming to represent Italian mob interests. Johnson emphasized that threatening Samuel Rothstein's family, specifically mentioning Rothstein's wife and children by name, was particularly serious and would not be overlooked. Johnson stated that Rothstein and his family were under Johnson's protection and that anyone who threatened them would face severe consequences. Messina attempted to leave, standing up from the table and moving toward the door. Johnson's associates blocked his path. Johnson stated that Messina would leave when their conversation was finished and not before. Johnson explained that Messina had 2 options. He could acknowledge that he had acted without authorization and agree to specific terms that would resolve the situation, or he could maintain his position and face consequences that would be far more severe. Johnson outlined the terms Messina would need to accept. First, Messina would have no further contact with Samuel Rothstein or his family. Second, Messina would repay Samuel Rothstein $500 to compensate for the distress caused by threats against his family. Third, Messina would provide a written statement acknowledging that he had acted without authorization from any Italian mob authority. Fourth, Messina would communicate to Vincent Romano that neither of them would conduct any operations in Harlem without explicit authorization from Johnson. Johnson emphasized that these terms were remarkably generous given the seriousness of Messina's actions. Johnson stated that threatening families was considered among the most serious violations of underworld codes and typically resulted in permanent consequences. Johnson was offering Messina an opportunity to resolve the situation through accepting responsibility and agreeing to specific limitations on his future conduct. Messina recognized that he had badly miscalculated. Messina had assumed Rothstein was vulnerable and unprotected, an isolated Jewish operator whose status was unclear after Schultz's death. Instead, Rothstein was protected by Johnson, who had sufficient authority and capability to confront Messina directly and to impose consequences for his unauthorized actions. Messina also recognized that Johnson had investigated thoroughly and had confirmed with Costello that Messina was acting without authorization, eliminating any ability to claim official backing. Messina agreed to Johnson's terms. Over the following hour, Messina provided a handwritten statement acknowledging he had visited Rothstein without authorization and had made inappropriate threats. Messina counted out $500 in cash that would be delivered to Rothstein. Messina agreed that neither he nor Romano would operate in Harlem without Johnson's explicit permission. Johnson accepted Messina's agreement and stated that compliance would be monitored carefully. Johnson emphasized that any violation of the terms would result in immediate and severe consequences. Messina was permitted to leave the warehouse with the clear understanding that his actions had been identified, addressed, and would not be forgotten. Over the following days, Johnson implemented the final components of his strategy. Johnson personally delivered the $500 to Samuel Rothstein on November 23rd, explaining that the situation had been resolved and that Messina had been confronted and had agreed to cease all contact with Rothstein and his family. And Johnson emphasized that Rothstein and his family were under Johnson's protection and that any future threats would be addressed immediately. Johnson also ensured that word of what had occurred spread through appropriate channels in both black and Italian criminal networks. The story that circulated emphasized several points. Unauthorized enforcers had attempted to extort a Harlem operator by threatening his family. Johnson had investigated and confirmed the actions were unauthorized. Johnson had confronted the enforcers and secured their agreement to cease their activities and provide compensation. Johnson's protective authority extended to all legitimate operators in Harlem, regardless of their ethnic background. This narrative served multiple strategic purposes. It demonstrated that Johnson's protection was real and enforceable rather than merely symbolic. It showed that Johnson investigated thoroughly before acting, distinguishing between authorized and unauthorized actions. It illustrated that Johnson coordinated with Italian mob authorities like Costello rather than operating unilaterally. It established that threatening families would result in swift consequences, regardless of who made such threats. The broader impact became apparent over subsequent weeks and months. Frank Costello's investigation confirmed that Messina and Romano had acted without authorization and had falsely claimed to represent Italian mob interests. Costello arranged for both men to be disciplined within Italian mob structures, including financial penalties and prohibitions on operating in certain territories. This disciplinary action reinforced the message that unauthorized operations in Harlem violated not just Johnson's authority, but also Italian mob rules. Samuel Rothstein's continued operation of the Consolidated Bookkeeping Services Office without further interference demonstrated the effectiveness of Johnson's protection. Rothstein maintained his administrative responsibilities, calculating and distributing payments according to the established percentages, without anyone attempting to extort additional money or threatening his family. The security Johnson had arranged remained in place for several months before being gradually reduced as the threat conclusively ended. The incident created unexpected positive effects on Johnson's relationships across ethnic lines in New York's underworld. One, Jewish operators who had been uncertain about their status after Schultz's death recognized that Johnson's protective authority extended to them if they operated legitimately within established arrangements. This recognition encouraged cooperation and discouraged independent attempts to negotiate separate deals with Italian authorities. Italian mob figures, including Costello, developed increased respect for Johnson's approach to managing Harlem. Johnson had addressed a problem created by Italian enforcers without creating conflict with Italian mob leadership. Johnson had investigated thoroughly, had communicated through appropriate channels, had coordinated his response with Italian authorities, and had resolved the situation in ways that reinforced rather than challenged the established arrangement. This demonstrated sophistication that earned respect from people who might otherwise have viewed Johnson as merely a local operator requiring supervision. The incident also illustrated fundamental principles about how authority operates in environments where formal legal protections are absent. Rothstein could not rely on police to protect his family from organized crime threats. Rothstein's safety and his family's security depended entirely on whether he was protected by someone with sufficient power to deter and punish threats. Johnson's willingness to extend that protection to Rothstein, a Jewish operator with no personal relationship to Johnson beyond their business connection, demonstrated that Johnson's authority was based on systematic protection of all legitimate operators in his territory, rather than on favoritism toward particular individuals or ethnic groups. This inclusive approach to protection created loyalty that extended beyond the specific individuals directly protected. Other operators throughout Harlem recognized that Johnson distinguished between legitimate business activity and unauthorized extortion, and that Johnson would protect the former while punishing the latter. This created incentives for operators to work within Johnson's system rather than attempting to circumvent it or negotiate separate arrangements. The incident's resolution also reflected Johnson's strategic understanding of how to build authority through demonstrating capability rather than through constant violence. Johnson could have responded to Messina's threats by ordering violent retaliation without investigation or communication with Costello. Such response might have deterred future threats, but would have created conflict with Italian mob authorities who would view Johnson's unilateral violence against Italian enforcers as challenge to their authority. Instead, Johnson investigated first to understand whether Messina had official backing, communicated with Costello to clarify the situation, secured Costello's acknowledgement that Messina was acting without authorization, and only then confronted Messina in ways that demonstrated Johnson's capability while avoiding unnecessary conflict. This approach achieved protection for Rothstein while strengthening rather than damaging Johnson's relationship with Italian mob authorities. The $500 that Messina paid to Rothstein as compensation served symbolic purposes beyond the monetary value. The payment acknowledged that Rothstein had been wronged and deserved recompense. The payment came from Messina personally rather than from Johnson, making clear that Messina bore responsibility for his actions. The payment was delivered by Johnson to Rothstein, demonstrating Johnson's role as protector and enforcer of justice within his domain. These symbolic elements reinforced narratives about Johnson's authority and about the standards of behavior expected within operations under his protection. The written statement Messina provided acknowledging his unauthorized actions created documentation that could be used in future situations if Messina or others attempted similar actions. The statement established precedent that could be referenced to demonstrate patterns of unauthorized activity and could be shared with Italian mob authorities if enforcement became necessary. This documentation reflected Johnson's systematic approach to building cases and creating accountability rather than relying solely on immediate force. The coordination between Johnson and Costello in addressing the situation strengthened their working relationship and established patterns of communication that would prove valuable in subsequent years. Johnson had demonstrated that he would report problems to appropriate Italian authorities rather than immediately resorting to violence. Costello had demonstrated that Italian mob leadership would discipline unauthorized actors who violated established arrangements. This mutual demonstration of good faith and capability created foundation for continued cooperation. For Samuel Rothstein and his family, the resolution provided safety that had seemed impossible when Messina first made his threats. Rothstein had faced a situation where both available options, compliance or refusal, appeared to lead to disaster. Johnson's intervention had created a third option that Rothstein could not have achieved alone: protection through alignment with established authority that had both capability and willingness to address threats. Rothstein continued working in Harlem's numbers operations for many years after the 1936 incident, eventually becoming one of Johnson's most trusted administrators. The loyalty Rothstein developed toward Johnson stemmed not from abstract gratitude, but from concrete recognition that Johnson had protected Rothstein's family when they were genuinely threatened and vulnerable. This loyalty translated into reliable service and into advocacy for Johnson among other Jewish operators who might otherwise have been uncertain about cooperating with black criminal leadership. The broader legacy of the incident extended across ethnic groups in New York's underworld. The fact that a black crime boss had protected a Jewish operator's family from Italian enforcers demonstrated that ethnic identities did not determine all alliances and that cross-ethnic cooperation was possible when based on mutual interests and respect for established agreements. This lesson proved valuable during subsequent decades when New York's criminal organizations increasingly operated across ethnic lines. The incident also established precedent regarding protection of families. Criminal conflicts during the 1930s sometimes involved targeting opponents' families to create leverage or exact revenge. Johnson's strong response to Messina's family threats helped establish norm that families should be considered off-limits even in serious criminal conflicts. While this norm was not universally honored, Johnson's example created expectation that violating it would result in severe consequences from multiple sources, including both the family's direct protectors and the broader criminal authorities who valued stability. The quiet resolution of the crisis, threats neutralized within days, compensation provided, unauthorized actors disciplined, normal operations resumed, illustrated Johnson's preference for effective solutions over dramatic gestures. There was no public announcement about what had occurred. Johnson did not advertise his role in protecting Rothstein's family. The story spread naturally through the networks of people who knew Rothstein, who worked with Johnson, or who operated in circles where such information circulated. This quiet effectiveness characterized Johnson's most successful exercises of authority. Real power did not require constant publicity or dramatic demonstration. Real power meant that when problems arose, they were addressed swiftly and thoroughly through systematic investigation, appropriate communication, coordinated action, and enforceable resolution. The results spoke for themselves. Rothstein's family remained safe, unauthorized extortion ceased, established arrangements were reinforced, respect between organizations increased, and precedents were established that prevented similar problems in the future. The incident stood as one example among many of how Johnson built and maintained authority in Harlem through methods emphasizing intelligence, patience, and organization over violence and chaos. While Johnson certainly employed violence when necessary and had reputation for being dangerous when crossed, his long-term success derived from preventing situations from requiring violence by addressing threats early through investigation and by resolving conflicts through negotiation when possible. In the decades after 1936, as relationships between ethnic crime groups in New York continued evolving, participants sometimes referenced the Rothstein incident as example of how cross-ethnic protection and cooperation could function effectively. The story illustrated that authority based on consistent enforcement of clear rules could transcend ethnic divisions, that protecting vulnerable people created moral authority that complemented physical power, and that coordinating with potential rivals to address common problems could strengthen rather than weaken one's position. Whether remembered precisely or embellished through retelling, the narrative captured essential truths about how Johnson operated. He investigated before acting, he communicated through appropriate channels, he protected people under his authority, regardless of their backgrounds, he imposed serious consequences on those who violated established rules, and he achieved outcomes through strategic thinking rather than through impulsive force. These principles defined Johnson's approach throughout his career and explained why he maintained authority in Harlem for decades despite facing challenges from powerful organizations that controlled far greater resources than he commanded.